Hello, my name is Todd Baginski. I'm an 11-time SharePoint MVP and a partner and CTO at my company, Canviz. In this training module, I'm going to show you how to work with SharePoint context when developing SharePoint Framework components. This is section 2 of the Working with SharePoint Context training module. In this section, I will discuss using the HttpClient to communicate with SharePoint. In this section, I'm going to talk about the following topics: how to talk to SharePoint, how to coexist with mock data, and important patterns to follow. Communicating with SharePoint is pretty easy to do. You'll create a data model for the data, and you can reuse the same exact data model actually that you created for your mock data. So you can see in the screenshot here, if you watched the previous section of this module about how to make mock data, I'm doing the same thing where I create a new class called SPHttpList.ts, and then inside of that class as interface, I define a title and a ID, both of type string, that I will use to represent that SharePoint list item. After you have that created, then what you'll want to do is import the data model into the webport class, create a method to return the mock data, and then use the SharePoint context SPHttpClient to actually call the SharePoint REST APIs and get the data back. So the code here illustrates how I've done those things. First, I imported the data model into the class. Then I created a method called getSharePointListData. And as you can see, it returns a call from this.context.SPHttpClient.get. It passes in the absolute URL of the web it's currently executing in, and then the /API/web/lists, and then the filter after that. That's actually the URL that invokes the REST API. Once the REST API returns the response, it returns the response's JSON object, and then when that is done, the JSON object's values are added to that interface I created to represent my data model. So it's great to have your web part work so that it can use mock data when you're in your local workbench, but it can use real SharePoint data when you're in the SharePoint workbench where you've actually deployed it to a SharePoint site. So coexisting mock data with real data coming from SharePoint follows this pattern. First, you check the environment type to determine if the web part is running in the local environment. If it is, then you will invoke the method to call the SharePoint REST API when it's not in the local environment. But if it is running in the local environment, then you will return the mock data when you're running in the local environment. You can see that here. The if statement says if environment type is equal to environment type.local, then return the mock data. Else, go call that method to return the SharePoint list data. Here's some important patterns to keep in mind as you do these things. Use e-tags to ensure your data integrity when you are updating and deleting SharePoint list items. You don't have to worry about that with mock data. Chain promises when you're performing multiple asynchronous ops as part of one use case. You can see how we did that in the previous slides and in the code associated with this module. Whenever you have an error, break that chain of promises and handle that error gracefully. You can use that with the utility methods inside of SharePoint Framework. Always retrieve a list item's entity type to model the items in the REST queries, and optimize your REST responses for performance. When using React, use the Office UI Fabric React components to build your user interface. Use state to keep track of the web part's status and data, and use the web part's HTTP client in a React component. With Angular, you're going to want to load your Angular and ng Office UI Fabric from the CDN. Use conditional rendering for one-time web part setup at the very beginning when you first render your web part. That's when you want to conditionally render things. And pass web part configuration to Angular and react to configuration changes in the Angular application. The SharePoint PnP JavaScript library, if you're using that, use that library with the SharePoint Framework client-side web parts. Configure global request headers and override them for specific requests as needed. Sort and select the top N items from a list with the Fluent API. Collectively, if you follow these patterns, depending on which type of JavaScript framework you're working with, your SharePoint frameworks will work very well for you. Now I'm going to show you a demo of how you can use the HTTP client to talk to SharePoint. Okay, so now we've seen how we can make mock data and do that in our local environment. Let's see how we can use the HTTP client that comes with the SharePoint framework to actually communicate with SharePoint and retrieve real list items from SharePoint. So the first thing I'd like to point out is now I'm in exercise 2 of module 3 here. Exercise 2 just builds right on top of exercise 1. So it's the same web part and I'm just adding more code to it. This is also available for you in the GitHub repo, and you can go through the lab manual to follow the steps that I did to build this that I'm showing you. So the first thing that I did was I came into my Hello World React web part. This is my base web part class, and I imported the environment and the environment type variables. This is going to allow me to communicate with the SharePoint framework and determine which environment and environment type I'm working in, so I can decide if I want to render the mock data or if I want to render the data that's really coming from SharePoint. Now, to work with the SharePoint HTTP client, I have to import that as well. So here's my import statement that allows me to use it. The next thing you'll notice that has changed here is I have added a new method called get SharePoint list data. Remember I had the get mock list data one before? Well, this one actually returns real data from SharePoint. And inside of it, here you can see how I create the URL to go get the data by going to the absolute URL of the web, and then API, web, lists, and then I hit the filter, don't show me hidden lists. And so that is my REST API query. And so right here in line 67, the SharePoint HTTP client, I call the get method, I pass in that URL, the version 1 of the configurations I want to use, and that will invoke that REST API and return my response. And I get the JSON back for the response right there. And then I get the values out of that JSON and return it as a promise of that interface type I created before that had the title and the description of it representing my list data. Then I modified my get list data method. I now have an environment type and I see if it's local. If it is local, I want to get the mock list data back because I don't have any SharePoint context, and actually using the SharePoint HTTP client get call right here, that would fail because there's no SharePoint context associated with it. When I am not in a local environment, I fall into the else statement here, and that's when I invoke the get SharePoint list data method to return that information. Finally, up in my render method, you can see now I'm calling get list data instead, and get list data is the one that makes the determination if I'm going to return the mock data or the SharePoint list data. So now that I run it, here we have it again in my local workbench, and it's added to the page, and I see my mock data returned. If I bounce over to this page, this is actually my SharePoint workbench running in SharePoint. If I make the URL bigger at the top, you can see here, this is actually running on Office 365 in my SharePoint workbench. And now it is returning the actual IDs and the titles for the lists that really do exist inside of that website. In this demo, I demonstrated how to talk to SharePoint, how to coexist between mock data and SharePoint data, and important patterns to follow while you're developing SharePoint web parts that interact with SharePoint data. You can learn more about SharePoint Framework and all the things we've talked about here in the SharePoint Patterns and Practices. You can get to this via the URL aka.ms/SharePointPNP. There's a ton of code samples and solutions, reusable components, a lot of guidance documentation, and also monthly community calls that you can watch here to learn all about the SharePoint framework, SharePoint add-ins, Microsoft Graph, and Office 365 APIs.